you live from Rockingham Township, Vermont. Again, still Santa Cruz County's #1 Google Slides live stream. And today we are talking about a problem, and that problem is the problem of animal minds. The problem of animal minds is this. Well, do animals have a mind that's like ours in whatever relevant ways? Or do they not? Now, this is a pretty big deal ethically, because many kind of ways of thinking about the value of human beings in the world of philosophy are mind-centric. You might talk about, for instance, the experience of pleasure and pain, something that we have been talking about with respect to oysters, for the last few weeks. Or you could talk about having virtue, the cognitive virtues. Or you could talk about having reason. That would be an Epicurean, a Peripatetic, and a Stoic approach to human value, respectively. Each of them mind-centric, and so begging the question, do animals have minds like ours? Because that would entail treating them like we treat human beings, which is rather dramatically different than we, being ancient people, do treat animals. Eating them, and that's really the least of their problems. And this is a problem that really vexes ancient philosophers too. You have, for instance, the Pythagorean approach, and this is almost one of the few things we're moderately certain about when we talk about ancient Pythagoreanism, the stuff that Pythagoras actually thought, that animals not only have minds like ours, but actually, because of the process of metempsychosis or reincarnation, by which we are reborn as animals, animals have our minds, or perhaps the minds of close deceased friends. So it follows from this, and this may have been an inference that Pythagoras himself drew, that you can't eat animals, which is a rather dramatic call to make in ancient Greece, because that screws up the whole sacrifice-centered socialization process of the ancient Greek polis. So there's a real political dimension to this problem. I mean, a ton of stuff hinges on whether you think animals have minds like ours. So Pythagoreanism is kind of an out there solution. A bit more normal is the quip of Chrysippus, the Stoic, that pigs have souls in the same way that bacon has a kind of a bit of salt in it. It's like a preservative. The pigs have a soul in the sense that they're alive. They go around. They don't rot where they stand. But that soul is not a mind. It doesn't do the same thing that human minds do. The only purpose of that soul is to keep the pig meat fresh so that we can dig into it when we want to eat it. Because pigs love to get eaten. Well, actually, they don't love anything because they don't have minds, but it is providential that pigs are there for us to eat. So for Chrysippus and the Stoics, and really for most ancient philosophers, animals don't have minds like ours. They have souls, but those souls are not minds. Well, the problem is, we see animals acting like humans all the time in kind of humanish ways. Using tools, having purpose in what they do, and attributing mind to animals, saying, well, these animals think just like humans, so when they act humanishly, they are cogitating in the same way that humans do, and their actions are the result of thought in the same way that human actions are. Well, that's one really kind of straightforward way of explaining why animals seem to act humanishly, like humans. That's not the only way, but it's an obvious one. It's a perspicuous one, and it runs against this whole kind of tendency that I've been talking about in ancient thought to say that animals don't have minds except as a kind of preservative. Well, the classic example from ancient philosophy is this problem of the deducing dog. It's a little thought experiment, observational comedy. I'm not really sure what the status of this is. So you got a dog that's chasing a rabbit, and it comes to a fork in the road, and it sniffs one path, And then, without further nasal ado, it heads off down the other one, where the rabbit is, one supposes. It appears as though the dog is using a process of elimination to save time by positing, hey, there are two possible alternatives here for where the rabbit's gone. The leftmost one, say, is excluded by the fact that it does not smell like rabbit. So I'm going to go off down the right because that is the alternative that's left. It's a deductive approach to figuring out where the rabbit is. And that appears to be a cognitive process. So this is the classic problem case of human-like, apparently rational behavior by an animal that ancient philosophers talk about, probably more than any others. One approach, which is an approach that Aristotle will take and that a lot of other people will take following him, is to say that the dog acts as if it is reasoning. Hos peran or hos perane are the phrases that he uses in Greek in the Historia Animalium, where a lot of these problems kind of come up. And the suggestion there is that the dog only appears to be doing what we do for the reasons that we do it. The dog may actually be functionally making a deduction, but it's not using a mind to do that. It's not doing logic, heaven forbid. Now, for Aristotle, this actually has a much more sort of complicated technical sense. It's not just hand-waving, although it is a bit of that. What Aristotle says is that animals do with fantasia what we do with the rational soul, the mind. Fantasia is something that Aristotle says we all have, humans and animals alike. It's hard to figure out exactly what it is, but Martha Nussbaum has a really kind of good account of it, where it's something like subjectivity, the ability to be a subject and be conscious of sensation. It's kind of consciousness. It's not thinking necessarily. It's not reflective. And the Aristotelian account of that doggy deduction that we were talking about is that it happens in the fantasia, not in any kind of logical faculty or mind. You could say that's a bit like an instinct. A more evocative and probably more correct way of thinking about it is to say that there's just something in the structure of the dog's world where deduction is part of the dog's direct perception of the world. It's not something that the dog can think about, that the dog can, for instance, choose not to do. It's not a cognitive reflection of the world. It's just directly present in the way that the dog senses and experiences the world. So that's the fantasia account of how the dog appears to deduce. And following Aristotle, this is going to be popular among people from various philosophical schools, not just the peripatetic school, which he initiates. Now, one might reasonably be skeptical of the distinction Aristotle makes here between mind and fantasia as sources of deduction, even if it's well-formed in theory, which it is. It's a way of postulating that animals appear to think that's actually been taken up again in the 20th century by Jakob von Wexkull and his followers, various animal behavioral scientists. The problem with the Aristotelian position is that we can't actually tell that animals think like Aristotle says. It's a characterization of animal thought. They do it with fantasia rather than minds. That's impossible to verify because all of that stuff's kind of hidden behind a veil. We can't even open up a dog's head and see, the fantasia is doing the deductive work here. Or, there's actually a mind. It's unverifiable. And skeptics, people like Sextus Empiricus, the sort of main source we have for ancient skepticism, are going to take this account of dog deduction and say, well, how do you know? Maybe dogs do actually think like us. Dogs maybe do have thought bubbles. Maybe parrots use language like we do. Maybe monkeys aren't just imitating humans, but doing things as the result of cogitation. Right, it's a reasonable skeptic objection to the Aristotelian assertion. You can't know that it's true. There's no observational proof for this. It's kind of an a priori judgment, not on the basis of observation. And this skepticism that Sextus Empiricus invokes is also kind of the default position of natural history writers like Pliny, who have no problem at all describing animal actions in ways that impute attention or logical thought or memory, knowledge, cognition, any of this kind of mind properties to animals. Right? If you remember from a few lectures ago, even the humble oyster bites you for a reason. If you're underwater and going after its pearls, it knows you want that pearl, says Pliny. And it acts from that knowledge to bite you. So for the natural history writers, for reasons of narrative efficiency, but also for others, which we're going to talk about as the term goes on, animals do actually think much in the way that humans do. They don't think in this different, much more difficult to describe way, using fantasia that Aristotle talks about. Well, this discussion leads me to my favorite ancient theory of mind and animal mind. It's a unified theory of mind, and it's a real deep cut. That scraggly-looking dude on your screen is Strato of Lampsacus, Strato Lampsakenos. He's the third head of the Lyceum, the Aristotelian school in Athens, after Aristotle and Theophrastus, who we've talked about a little bit in these streams before. Strato comes third in that line, and he's much less well known than Aristotle or Theophrastus, both of whom we actually have some complete works from. We've just got fragments of Strato, so a lot of what follows is going to be reconstruction from those fragments. But it's one that's plausible. This stuff is all under debate, since the evidence is so kind of scanty. Well, what we do know about Strato, just on the basis of his reputation in antiquity, is that he takes Aristotle's thought in a much more materialist direction, which is something that a lot of Peripatetics, followers of Aristotle after Aristotle's death, tends to do. Strato was thought to have gone way too far in this direction, which is how he acquired the nickname Physicus. That's that weird abbreviation after the word Strato up there. It's Strato the physician or the physicist, because he offers natural material explanations for things rather than relying on forms or divine intervention or many of these sort of non-material substances that show up in other peripatetic thought. And so he also has a materialist explanation of mind. He says, rather than kind of this separate soul that does thinking and such, and the separate world of sensory perception, which Aristotle calls fantasia, we just have one thing. And it is a thing. It's a material thing. It's what he calls a hegemonikon, we think is what one of his words for it. And it's in our brain. Cool that somebody finally figured that out after generations of philosophers talking about like it was our heart that did the thinking. So Strato thinks that the brain is the material source of cognition, of mind. And that mind is just one thing. It's not divided in the way that Aristotle made it out to be. Well, how does Strato argue for this? Because it is a claim that we find, I think, instinctively plausible, believing as we do anyway that the brain is a thought organ, and tending as we also tend not to believe in souls. But Strato does have to offer a proof, because this claim is really kind of crazy and controversial, not only in the peripatetic thought of his time, but just in general. And his proof is that distraction happens. He says, well, thinking can distract us from what we're looking at. We can miss things that are right in front of our eyes if we're thinking really hard, and vice versa. Noise, flashy colors, jump scares all distract us from thinking. So distraction seems to cross this kind of thought-perception boundary. Stuff that should belong in fantasia screws up the operation of our intellectual soul, and vice versa. Stuff that goes on in the intellectual soul seems to block the smooth operation of our fantasia, our ability to perceive stuff. Now, if the soul and fantasia were actually just different things, like Aristotle said, it would be weird if they could interfere with themselves, with one another in this way. Like, if they were different things, you'd think they'd be able to kind of parallel process. But in fact, we observe, they can't. One blocks the other. So what makes sense of this is if we say all those functions happen in the same place. There's just the one thing that perceives, that thinks. There is no gap between fantasia and mind. Now, he says that animals are subject to the same kind of distraction phenomena. So they do have minds like ours. And maybe they can't go to college, but who knows? We have not ever tried to do it. Who knows what would happen if we did let those turkeys attend classes? Perhaps they would be no more distracted by their interest in gobbling and eating things off the ground than the average student is by looking at Facebook on the laptop they're supposed to be taking notes on. Well, the reason that I like this theory is not just because it's a little bit more egalitarian about the distribution of mind among various organisms, which I could take or leave, but because it turns the usual approach to the problem of mind and the soul in ancient texts by ancient philosophers upside down. As philosophers usually start from how good we are at stuff. Right? We can reason and we can do syllogisms and we can add numbers, and those are pretty amazing. So the mind, or part of the mind anyway, must also be pretty amazing. It's some kind of a winged soul that can be made to dance in the sky with wisdom ladies, or whatever. In any rate, it's definitely a lot better than whatever those dumb animals have. In fact, if you're looking at Plato, you see, well, he analogizes the parts of the soul that make us screw up, the appetitive part, the thumetic part of the soul, the spirited part, to animals. It says those are the kind of the animal parts, and then we've got like a truly human part that does the rational stuff. So, these philosophers all describe the rational mind in ways that make it seem pretty exalted, and then they make up excuses for why it actually fucks up most of the time. Well, Strato goes the other way, right? This is what I'm saying. He starts from how we constantly fuck up. This basic experience of getting distracted, of the mind not being able to do all the things we would like it to do at one time. And this is kind of a basic experience of ancient philosophy too. You've got the story of Thales and the well, Thales of Miletus, the first Greek philosopher, looking at the sky, staring at that magic starry globe up there, and he ends up in a well. He's distracted. This is a story that repeats time and again throughout the history of philosophers with different philosophers. David Hume falls into a bog. There's a funny story about that. And not to say that I'm a philosopher, I get distracted all the time too. I don't notice people that I know very well, like waving at me, because I'm like thinking hard about stuff. Usually just being anxious about nonsense, but still, it's an experience of distraction. Basic experience of having a mind is it not working because you get distracted. We all know this. Our minds suck at doing certain things. Most ancient philosophy, and actually a lot of modern philosophy of mind, is all about making us forget this, making us think that the mind is actually really good and cool. Strato, however, does not let us forget it. He never let us